Okay, well, welcome everyone to this session on connecting the national with the local. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm meeting on Boonwurrung country, but there will be people in all parts of Australia, and I acknowledge the traditional custodians around the whole of our nation. Welcome to everyone, to attendees, not just in Australia, but in many parts of the world. And welcome to this session on connecting the national to the local, which is part of the University of Melbourne SDGs Climate Change and City Symposium. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to encourage anyone to use the chat feature to the side of the window, which you can see if you've got issues that you'd like to raise. And if you have any tech questions, please navigate to the event support tab at the top of your screen, and one of our events team will help you resolve the issue. Okay, so what we're talking about today is connecting the national to the local, and more particularly, how do we connect national sustainable development goal reporting to local reporting and local action? We've got some great speakers who will be talking about this, and starting with Alison Leighton, who is from the City of Melbourne. Alison assumed the position of General Manager of Strategy, Planning and Climate Change at the City of Melbourne earlier this year. Prior to this, she was the Chief Executive Officer at Baw Baw Shire Council and the Chief Operating Officer at the Mornington Peninsula Shire. Alison has more than 15 years of progressive leadership experience in infrastructure planning, operations and public sector business transformation. We also have joining us from the Philippines, Renz Cerillo. Renz is a sustainability specialist with multidisciplinary experience in development, in science communications and climate mitigation. And Renz is part of the Southeast Asia Secretariat of ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, and manages programs on climate change, low emission strategies across Southeast Asia. So welcome to Alison and Renz. And I'm John Thwaites, and I'm chairing the session. I'm the chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute at Monash University, which aims to promote and implement the Sustainable Development Goals through our research, our education, our operations, but very much through community events like this and community leadership. My background started in local government. I was a local government mayor, and then I was in state government and was the Deputy Premier of Victoria and a minister responsible for many areas that are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I guess through my political experience, I've come to see how important it is in politics and government to have clear targets. In my experience, if you don't have clear goals and targets, government does very little. It just responds to the most recent crisis. And that's why I've become so passionate in support of the Sustainable Development Goals, because they do provide clear goals and targets for the things that matter most. But today, what we want to focus on is how do we link national Sustainable Development Goal reporting to local reporting? And I'm going to start talking about that national reporting. 2 years ago, I led a process to report on Australia's progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. And it was known as Transforming Australia. And we aim to provide an independent assessment about how Australia's going against the goals. And perhaps if we could put up the slides, Emily, now. And this process that we undertook was done with community consultation, but also with experts from around Australia who were able to make an assessment against the key goals and targets and indicators. And I'm not sure if everyone can see on the screen there now, but that's the link to the report that we had, Transforming Australia. And you can look it up, sdgtransformingaustralia.com. If you go to the next slide, Emily. Now, what we did was analyse against 86 targets and 144 indicators how Australia is performing. And our assessment was about 33% of the targets you'll see in green, or 35% rather, just over a third, we were going well and we were on track. Some 27% of the targets we were behind, but we believed that we could get there. 18% of the targets needed a breakthrough if we were going to achieve them. And 24% of the targets we were actually going backwards in Australia. And this was a national assessment which showed really Australia doing well in some areas and badly in others. And if we could go to the next slide. Now, this breaks up the findings by Sustainable Development Goal, and you'll see goal number 1 at the top, poverty, and then around the whole circle, you'll see Australia's achievement. And without going into all the details, the further up that spider diagram we are, so you'll see SDG 3 in green there, which is health, the better Australia is doing. And what you'll notice there is that Australia's performance is very variable. We're going very well in SDG 3, the green, and then the next SDG 4, which is education, we're going well. We're not doing nearly so well SDG 5, which is gender equality. And then if you go round the circle to SDG 13, climate change, you'll see we're doing very badly against the SDG indicators. Now, the goals are essentially to achieve economic prosperity, social fairness and inclusion, and environmental sustainability. And we analysed each of those areas. And if we go to the next slide, we looked, for example, at our economy. And the next slide, thanks. Unemployment. And perhaps if we just look at that, what you'll see from that, that's unemployment in Australia, which has come down considerably since the late 1990s. But if you go to the next slide, underemployment, that is where people have a job, but they're not able to get as many hours as they might like to. They're not fully employed. You'll see that's gone up. And so around Australia, yes, unemployment has come down, but underemployment has gone up. Now, I highlight this as an example of a national statistic, which behind it has many local stories. And I think it's very important that we get local data about local employment as well. Perhaps if I go to the next slide. Here's another statistic, though, which shows business investment in research and development across Australia going backwards. And I think this is an example of one that's probably less local. It's really a national issue. And so we probably, for this one, don't need localisation. If we go to the next slide, and then the next one, our society, and probably one of the most important things is our life expectancy. And you'll see in blue, that's Australia's life expectancy in 1970, which was just over 70 years. Now, if we go forward to 2015, you'll see our life expectancy's gone well over 80. And if you compare Australia to other countries, we've actually improved relative to many of those countries. And we now have one of the longest life expectancies in the world. And this is another example of a indicator where localisation is critical, because I was actually health minister here in Victoria, and it shocked me when I first found that there was a difference in life expectancy of up to 5 years just across Melbourne, the suburbs. Perhaps if we look at the next slide. And a key contributor to health is obesity. And you'll see when we analysed Australia's performance on obesity, we were one of the countries with the highest levels of obesity in the world, nearly 30%. And once again, it's very interesting to look at that from a local perspective. And across cities, you'll see quite big differences in levels of obesity in different parts of the city. If we go to the next slide, our environment, and the next slide, and then the next one, what you'll see there is Australia's carbon emissions back since 1990. And the sad truth is that our emissions today are very similar to our carbon emissions in 1990. And that means we're not getting anywhere near the Paris target that we need if we're going to have a safe climate and be well below 2 degrees. And once again, this is a statistic, an indicator where localisation of climate performance, of emissions is very important. So that's the end of my slides. Thanks, Emily. Oh, no, sorry, one other slide I want to refer to, just to say that we are doing an update of this report for COVID impacts. And that shows the impact of COVID on unemployment. You'll see before COVID in blue, after COVID in black, a significant increase in unemployment across different areas and different ages. And once again, that's something where I think we'd really benefit by a localisation of the SDGs. So thanks, Emily. That's the last slide. I think that's the end of my slides. And so just in conclusion, I just wanted to give you a snapshot there of the national picture across the economy, society, and the environment, which shows we're doing well in some areas and badly in others, but also shows how some of those statistics, like life expectancy, obesity, carbon emissions, really need to be localised if we're going to have a real picture of where we're doing well and where we're doing badly. So with an opportunity now to talk about in more detail about how a major council, the Melbourne City Council, is localising the SDGs, I'll now hand on to Alison. Alison.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today at this SDG symposium. I too would like to recognise the traditional custodians of the land that I am on, and that is the Bunurong Boonwurrung peoples of the East Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And if we can get the presentation up, that would be fantastic, please, Emily. Okay, brilliant. So over the last 12 months, the City of Melbourne has significantly accelerated its activity and investment in the UN SDG framework, and also in our understanding of the role that we can play as a global city in achieving the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In my brief presentation this morning, I'm going to provide you with a high-level overview of this activity and then focus particularly on how we have partnered with the University of Melbourne to ensure that we can connect and compare our local efforts not only to other global cities, but also to the national and global perspectives. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Like many cities across the globe, Melbourne has and continues to be severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. For our international guests here in Melbourne, we are still under quite severe restrictions, and our economy and overall health and wellbeing has suffered as a result. At the outset of the pandemic, the City of Melbourne formed a City of the Future task force to understand the impacts of the pandemic and to also plan for our recovery in the short, medium and long term. This work culminated in the production of a reactivation and recovery plan for Melbourne. The plan, which was developed using a design-led approach, involved input from experts locally and globally, as well as from community members, and it contains several recovery initiatives and actions. Importantly, these actions are directly aligned to the UN SDGs with the overriding objective of ensuring that the future we build is prosperous, sustainable and inclusive for all. The plan was endorsed by our Council in mid-September of this year, and it is an important first step in embedding the UN SDGs in our planning and prioritisation processes. Next slide, please. In June of this year, the City of Melbourne entered into an important partnership with the Connected Cities Lab at the University of Melbourne. The goals of the partnership are to explore how the UN SDGs could integrate and embed into City of Melbourne planning, reporting and benchmarking practices. This involves two key pieces of work. The first is a voluntary local review to set a data baseline against the SDG goals and indicators and to enable measurement of our progress against the SDG targets. And the second is a strategic prioritisation framework to further embed SDG thinking into our strategic and business planning processes to ensure that our investment in programs, projects and services in the city are aligned to our SDG objectives. So far this work has involved a literature review of different approaches to voluntary local reviews around the world, analysis of the SDG targets relevant to the City of Melbourne, being an urban environment, a data gap analysis which reconciled existing City of Melbourne data against the relevant SDG targets and identified where additional data would be required. And then finally, consideration of how we enable both city to city and local to national comparison over time. So this slide actually shows that of the 169 SDG targets, 127 are relevant to the City of Melbourne. Also shown in this diagram are the indicators that are relevant to each target, and they are denoted by an asterisk. The data gap analysis focused on those indicators that are highlighted via the coloured bars in the diagram, and it found that about 36% of the targets were already covered by data that we at the City of Melbourne were collecting and analysing. So addressing the remaining gaps is a critical next step in this work, and it's vital in ensuring that we establish an accurate baseline in our VLR. Next slide, please. This slide shows our objective of maintaining both vertical and horizontal lines of sight to ensure the greatest level of comparability can be achieved. On the right, there are the three levels of the SDG framework. Firstly, the 17 goals remain unchanged and focused on sustainable development at the global scale. Our literature review found that early iterations of VLRs saw the localisation of these goals, but it was found that this approach actually limited the integration of local efforts with national and regional agendas, and it also limited city-to-city comparability. The localisation process for us will primarily focus on the target level, and a key next step in our work here will be to facilitate a workshop with internal City of Melbourne stakeholders to look at how we can genuinely localise those key targets. And finally, the indicators, which form the basis of the city-to-city comparison, and where possible will also demonstrate the contribution that the City of Melbourne will be making to the achievement of each of the goals at the state, national and even potentially the global scale. As an example, in recent years, the City of Melbourne has facilitated a number of renewable energy projects, and that has led to significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions within the city. And this has impacted positively on the performance of the local, state and national scale. So this is the sort of example where we're wanting to be able to demonstrate what contribution we make as a global city to those goals, whether that be at the national or international level. Importantly, keeping the indicators as a global standard will enable us to seek out and learn from cities who excel in particular indicators, and that's going to be a big focus for us in the medium to long term. So as far as next steps go, over the next few months, our partnership with the University of Melbourne will be focused on completing the VLR and continuing to develop our prioritisation framework in advance of a new council term commencing in November later this year. I'll leave it at that for now, but to conclude, I would just like to recognise the expertise and contribution from the team at the University of Melbourne Connected Cities Lab, and also the team at the City of Melbourne, the Climate Change Action and City Resilient Branch. We are all really excited by this work, and we look forward to sharing our progress with the global community as we continue our partnership. And I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Alison. Well, now if we can get a perspective from another part of the region, from the Philippines, it'd be marvellous to hear from you, Renz.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all safe and well. My name is Renz from Manila, Philippines, and I'm part of the Southeast Asia Secretariat of ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability. And ICLEI is an international nonprofit and network of 2,000 local and regional governments. So we're talking about cities, municipalities, and towns. And we work with our partners across the world in delivering solutions that are low emission, nature-based, equitable, resilient, and circular. with the work that we do, we reach 20% of the world population, and we are a firm believer of holistic and inclusive sustainable development. Therefore, SDGs really are required to our programs, and localizing the SDGs involves multi-level governance. So if we can put up my slides, please. Great, thanks, Emily. So can we go to the next one? Before I proceed with the localization process in terms of delivering and reporting of the SDGs in the Philippines, I want to provide some high-level context in the ASEAN region. So more than the SDGs, we also have the ASEAN 25 vision, which is really about trying to promote cooperation in three areas: political security, economic, and social cultural. So inevitably, this vision really wants to reduce the gap between our member states, because our member states are at a varying level of socioeconomic progress. And this vision, more importantly, is trying to identify the complementarity of the SDGs with the ASEAN community in building our efforts to uplift the standards of living of our people. So with the SDGs in one hand and the ASEAN 25 vision on the other, there's really stronger impetus for the localization of SDGs among the ASEAN member states. Now you can see also in the next long-term vision for the Philippines, which is the primary catalyst for action. And now we have the Philippine Development Plan, or PDP, which aligns with the term of the president. So the Philippine Development Plan really is a primary catalyst for the localization of the SDGs. It supports the Philippines' long-term vision plan called Ambition Natin 2040, which is a wordplay that translates to our Vision 2040. It's a 25-year long-term vision developed by the government as a guide for development planning. Now that we have the Philippine Development Plan, it has subsequently been cascaded to the whole of government, including at the local level. So the Philippines really has employed a whole of government and whole society approach to SDG implementation. And now this PDP, or the Philippine Development Plan, is also accompanied by a socioeconomic report, which provides you the matrix whether or not we're achieving the targets we have set out in this Philippine Development Plan. So you have the United Nations SDGs, and the way we measure that is through the Voluntary National Report. In the Philippines, we have the Philippine Development Plan, and the way we measure our success against that is through the socioeconomic report. So we just want to merge those two together. Now, I want to talk more about, if we can go to the next slide, please, to the process of the Philippines Voluntary National Reviews. So I guess the process for the Philippines is more or less the same for other countries. It conducts national stakeholder workshops with different stakeholders to be more representative and inclusive as much as possible. But what I like to emphasize is that across the entire process of trying to get inputs from local governments, really have a robust process. For instance, in the process of development of VNR, we gather inputs from different stakeholders using this website that you can see on your screen. So different stakeholders can send in their inputs using this website. And also, aside from that, since we're an archipelago, we're really trying to actively break island and regional silos. So we conduct interagency workshops with the three major islands of the country, which are Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. So local government units have the opportunity to contribute to those regional consultation workshops, so they can air out their concerns, their priorities, and the areas that they want to be more represented in the voluntary national review process. And then, having discussed how local governments contribute to national consultation and the submission of inputs to the preparation of the VNR, this begs the question, how do these local governments supply the information and data that they share with the national government for them to be evidence-based and for these data sets that they submit to be really accurate? If we go to the next slide. Now, what local governments employ is a community-based monitoring system, or CBMS. So if you can see here that the administrative structure is that there's power and resources on top of national, and then it kind of expands at the bottom. And then in terms of information availability, we really have rich information at the national level, and that kind of tapers down as you go down to the village or barangay or community levels. So the community-based monitoring system, what it tries to do is to fill in the gap, because we're trying to collect as much locally available information from our communities, from the household. So it really provides a rich, robust set of information from the communities so that we can provide really evidence-based information to policy making processes and decision making at the national level. So now that we have the CBMS, the LGUs are expected to localize the SDGs, and for them to be able to do so, they will need this CBMS data. And because going back to the principle of the SDGs, to leave no one behind, that really requires disaggregated data, and CBMS is able to provide that. So the CBMS can be used to generate SDG indicators at the local level, including the measurement of multidimensional poverty index covering 9 dimensions, and the required disaggregation for these indicators. And then the implementation of the CBMS enables LGUs to collect, process, and establish a local database using structured tools and training modules, taking into account local context and capacities. So the CBMS can also collect, the existing CBMS is a data collection instrument in the Philippines that can generate at least 39 local level SDG indicators. So now that we have a dearth of SDG data, the CBMS is able to fully complement that so that our policy making processes, decision making process really are representative of the people on the ground who are most likely the ones being affected, so that we don't leave anyone behind. At the same time, the CBMS also gathers data on physical characteristics of communities as well as available services, facilities, and areas through community-based profile questionnaire that can be overlaid with the socioeconomic data generated from the CBMS household census. So how it's being done, the process flow is that the CBMS entails the use of a structured data collection tool, and then the household and village community questionnaires were originally administered by traditional pen and paper for field census operation, although starting 2014, we have now started using a CBMS accelerated poverty profiling application, which makes it so much easier to streamline data collection for our enumerators. So I think that's pretty much it, and I'll be happy to address any questions later on.
Well, thank you very much, Renz. That was fascinating, and I think it's a good place to start the discussion, and that is the community-based monitoring. And maybe if I start with Alison, I'm wondering, as the City of Melbourne is going through the process of doing the voluntary local review, but importantly setting targets, what role is there for the local community in that?
Thanks, John. That's an excellent question, and one that we feel very strongly about. So we recognise that community participation in this process is paramount to ensure that it's successful and to ensure that we're able to promote the work that we're doing within our city. And in fact, ultimately, the movement on the targets will be reliant not only on the City of Melbourne, but also on a whole range of partners and players within the city. And so we need to ensure that we're involving community in the setting of those targets. So as we move towards getting a better idea of what localisation of the particular targets looks like, we're then going to take that information and take it out to the community to test and understand what their views are in terms of what we're suggesting we strive towards.
Great. And Renz, there are two aspects of the community input. One is, as Alison's just been talking about, which is an input into the targets, but also you're getting data directly from the community. And would you like to give us some more details about the sort of data that you get from the community groups?
Thank you, John. You're absolutely right. I think the CBMS system is really a robust process of trying to get accurate picture of what's happening locally. So the kind of core indicators that the CBMS includes would be on multi-dimensional poverty indices. So that covers SDG data on health, nutrition, housing, water and sanitation, education, income, employment, peace and order. So the national government would have an idea of what these things are happening on the ground. But then when you compare it with what's really happening locally, then you get like a like a stark difference between the two. There was one instance wherein the CBMS data from one city in the Philippines was used for a UNDP project. So the local government's priority for that project was on innovation and economic security. But then when we lay the CBMS data against that, it turns out that local communities, what they really need would be more programs on water and sanitation, education, and food. So it's really the CBMS data that surface these kinds of discrepancies with what the national government thinks versus what the local communities really need.
And I guess one of the challenges here, and there's a question that's come on the chat about this, is whether you think there'd be a level of subjectivity of people living in different areas in the responses they're giving, and how do you play an oversight about interpreting that level of subjectivity, as opposed to, say, national statistical bodies like we have in Australia, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who will be responsible in a consistent way for collecting and reporting on data. When you're using community-based data, how do you ensure that there's a level of consistency and objectivity in that?
I think for one, there would be a lot of validation exercises that happens within the community themselves. And then these validation workshops also happen at the regional level, the provincial level, and the national level. So there are a lot of opportunities for this data to be placed once against the national data and see the discrepancies. We're not saying that the national data really is an inaccurate picture, but what we're saying here is that CBMS provides a different perspective of what they think the local governments need, and then we're not replacing the national data, the data coming from the national government. In fact, we want to complement them and see how we can best target, how we can best shape the policies and programs that we're having.
And I suppose, Alison, one of the big challenges that you highlighted was how do you get comparability across cities? And I think you said that there's a risk that you might lose that. So I'm wondering, what measures is the City of Melbourne undertaking as part of this whole process to get some real comparability across cities across the world and in Australia?
Thanks, John. I think a really important part of the process that we've undertaken in partnership with the University of Melbourne so far has been the VLR literature reviews, the voluntary local review literature review. And what that has done is it's looked at across the globe where VLRs have been undertaken, how have they been undertaken, what has been their approach, and what does that mean for the City of Melbourne context. And so what we've determined is that the way to maximise comparability is to have consistency at the goal level and also at the indicator level, but actually localise the targets. And so one of the pieces of work with the VLR literature review has been looking at what other cities across the globe have done as far as their identification of targets and seeing how that might compare to our own situation. And I think we're right at that process now where we're looking at the data sets that we already have at the City of Melbourne, how that the extent that they cover off on the targets and indicators within the framework, and then what additional data we may need to curate in order to be able to adequately assess and benchmark ourselves. And importantly, a big part of our process is going to be the longitudinal view of this. So not just a one-off VLR in terms of how do we stand right now in comparison to the targets, but actually measuring how we progress over time and really exploring the actions that we take and the effectiveness of those actions in terms of our ability to move the needle on the targets.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted a critical point there, that the objective of this whole exercise is not just to collect data, it's actually to affect positive change. Yeah. And there's a risk sometimes with these, if you like, league tables or benchmarks across cities, that they're seen as some sort of competition rather than seeing how can we improve. And, you know, a classic example, I guess, is Melbourne, you know, being voted the most livable city, and then we come second in the world and everyone says, oh, isn't that terrible? But really, I question whether the most livable city data has had any real effect on changing what we do. because people just look at this one number and don't look behind that to see what changes do we need. And I guess it'd be worth exploring now this issue of change as a result of doing this data collection. And I guess if I start with Renz, maybe if I ask, as a result of these processes, how do you see governments and communities actually changing what they're doing?
Thank you for that. I think I want to go back to my previous example about a UNDP project that has happened in one of the cities in the southern Philippines. So you have a project called with the UNDP called Local and Urban Governance Dashboard, which was developed by UNDP Bangkok Regional Hub. So what the project wants to do is want to assess and visualize data to and allow so that you can allow the subnational and local governments to layer different sets of data to get a comprehensive picture of local development context. So when we were looking at the national statistics and the data, it seems to the project implementers that the priority of the government was really on economic security, innovation, infrastructure, whereas households would really talk about prioritizing clean water and sanitation and really zero hunger. So you have these different problems that are taking place in real life when the subnational government is talking about other things. So when they had the findings of the project, for that pilot project, they really the results of that really help shape the different priority planning for the city. So instead, the government looked on really the different priority needs of the local communities, which is on water and sanitation and achieving zero hunger for the communities. So I think that's one positive thing that the CBMS was able to provide us.
And Alison, I know you've said that the aim of the voluntary local review is to lead to change in what the council does. Can you talk through what that will look like, how that process will be implemented?
Absolutely. I might just start also by mentioning that as far as that sort of risk of the competition coming out in the VLR process across the globe, we really see ourselves as part of that global community, and we want to show leadership, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, around what is possible with a voluntary local review and a prioritisation framework. One of the things that we're very keen to do, hopefully when the pandemic restrictions start to be lifted, is actually visit other cities, other global cities that are excelling in particular indicators, and understanding what it is about how they're going about things that's resulting in that performance, learning from that and bringing it back to Melbourne, but then not only applying it to our situation, but partnering with other developing cities within the Asia Pacific region to build capacity in those cities. So it's almost like a pay it forward model. We want to learn from others and then we want to pay it forward within our own region. And I think ultimately the amazing thing about the SDG goals is that they are truly global in nature, and our contribution as a global city is only, can only be so much, but the more we partner with other cities and the more we work together, the greater the result is that we're going to achieve. So we really do see ourselves as global citizens in that regard. So in terms of how we're going to apply it, we are going to develop, in partnership with the University of Melbourne, a prioritisation framework that enables us to truly embed into our regular planning and strategy development processes full consideration of the UN SDGs. So I'm talking about the development of our capital works program, the way in which we model and deliver our services to the citizens in our city. I'm talking about policy initiatives that drive external change within our environment. So we really want to absolutely embed SDG consideration in the way we undertake our BAU processes as a local government in Australia.
Great. And just going back to that issue about the involvement of the community too, do you see opportunities for using this as a tool for engagement with the community in determining their own futures?
Absolutely. So one of the requirements here in Victoria for a new council, so we'll have a new council coming in November. One of the requirements for that new council is they'll need to develop a new council plan and a new community vision. And that needs to be done within, I think, 6 months of the new council being elected. So the work we're doing right now is putting us in a position where we can utilise that framework, that SDG framework and the prioritisation matrix, to ensure that that is taken into account in the greatest possible way when we're working with that council to develop that plan and the vision. And in fact, it's a legislative requirement now here in Victoria that the community are involved very heavily in the development of that plan and vision. And we've sort of looked at the various stages of the next steps in this project, and we've identified, the ways in which the community can be involved. So it could be through target selection, it could be through data collection, as is the case in the Philippines. It could be through looking and determining, what our performance is over time. We really do believe that our greatest success will come from involving the community as much as we possibly can.
Great. And in the time we've got left, another issue I'd like to explore is the actual formal links between the different levels of government in this task. So, Renz, you said that in the Philippines you have an approach with the national and provincial and local governments. Is that a formal arrangement or is it informal? And how does that link to the goals?
Thanks for your question, John. It really is a formal arrangement. That's why it's really critical that the Philippine Development Plan has outlined it very, very well, that local governments and regional governments have a role to play in achieving the SDGs. So by creating that really stable legal framework, the local government units, the regional government units have really strong mandate to participate. So, and also the VNR process for the Philippines, as I mentioned, is trying to break the silos as we are an archipelago. So we're trying to break those issues with interconnectivity and then being able to participate in formal consultations with the national government, and through the provision of a community-based monitoring system, local and regional governments have a strong role that they can play in not only the reporting and provision of data to ensure that the SDGs are being targeted, but also in the delivery and in ensuring that the SDGs are being met.
Yes, I know in a lot of Asian countries there's a very sophisticated and formal structure for implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, in Indonesia, where the president heads the overall government committee for implementation, but there's a whole government ministry, Bappenas, responsible for planning to implement the goals. Alison, that's not the situation in Australia. So the reality is that the Sustainable Development Goals have very little traction at a federal government level. How do you see local and potentially state government being able to promote this more on a national stage?
Look, I think it's by demonstration, John. So really demonstrating the value of the SDG framework in our planning processes, and over time demonstrating the focus that it gives us in order to be able to move on those targets, as I mentioned earlier. So part of what we believe our role is not only as a capital city and leading, global cities, it's also around partnering with all of our metropolitan Melbourne councils in the broader region to share with them the work that we're doing, but also to learn from them. There are councils that are embracing the UN SDGs that are metropolitan councils that might have lessons that we can learn from as well. But I think there's a critical mass that we need to kind of establish from the bottom up. If we're not seeing that at the federal level in terms of that focus, then the critical mass needs to come from local government. I think state government are undertaking a range of measures that correlate very strongly with the UN SDGs. And so really, again, as a city, we're looking to strengthen our relationships with the relevant state government departments to socialise with them the work we're doing in this regard, and then just to demonstrate the value that it provides. And hopefully over time in Australia, we can then start to formalise those vertical integration structures rather than them being relatively informal, which is the case right now.
And I know we're doing work at Monash and Monash Sustainable Development Institute on localisation of the SDGs, and we're working with a number of local communities around Victoria in doing that. And we're getting great response from the communities. The challenge is for most Victorian communities, they don't even know about the goals. Once they know about them and you work with them, they embrace them. But I'd be interested in hearing from both of you. First, Alison, what's the City of Melbourne doing in promoting this with the local community, and how can you see we can build a greater understanding of the goals in the general community?
Look, I think that's a really critical point. That, you know, if we can embed this work and this framework in our vernacular in the city, and people understand, you know, the way in which we're prioritising our resources and assessing our performance, then really we can again continue to build on that momentum that we already have with the UN SDGs. I think that I mentioned before the sort of legislative requirements for a new council. Part of that is around deliberative democracy, so actually really working with the community to involve them in our decision-making processes. So as part of that, we'll be kind of outlining the UN SDGs and the benefits that it brings us in terms of our investment and resource modelling. And I think also once we get a bit further in our process, we will look to promote the work that we're doing, so promote the partnership that we have with the University of Melbourne and really utilise our communication channels to raise awareness about the fantastic work that's happening between our two organisations.
Great. And Renz, how do you promote the understanding about the SDGs with people at the local community level in the Philippines?
Well, I'm very happy to note that the promotion of the SDGs has almost become second nature to local governments, because as I mentioned earlier, the national government mandates local governments to integrate the SDGs in their implementation and development plans, in their investment plans, and so that they really are mandated by the law to enable and deliver policies and programs that will facilitate the achievements of the SDGs. So in terms of promotion, the Philippines, there's really strong appetite for local governments to promote it, because Philippine, politicians would find the SDGs very sexy. So it really appeals to a lot of audience. So for instance, there's one city government in the Philippines that has painted its entire sports stadium with the images of the SDGs. So you get that kind of really positive response in terms of promoting it, but also in terms of partnerships with the universities and different organizations. They really are trying to align their programs with the SDGs. So you don't necessarily just deliver a program in a silo, but you try to align them with the Philippine National Plan, but also with the SDGs. So I think it's really, I'm really happy that it's happening here, at least in the Philippines.
I've got a question here that's come up. Alison might address to you. The City of Melbourne involves many businesses and workers and students who are not residents and therefore don't get a vote in the election. How will the City of Melbourne engage with those stakeholders?
That's an excellent question, and we've just had a discussion this week at our senior executive leadership team meeting around what is community in the City of Melbourne, and this is in the context of planning for our new council and delivering on this work. And we were in absolute agreement that the community are not just the residents and business and landowners; they're the people that visit the city, that come to the city to be educated, to recreate. Our community needs to be defined in the broadest determination. So